If you ever rode a motorcycle in Britain, the chances are you rode on Avons, the name on the rubber that taught a generation of riders to trust the road beneath them. At its peak, the Melksham factory turned out 1.5 million tyres a year, and for 6 straight seasons, every solo motorcycle world champion on Earth rode to his title on Avon rubber. They survived 2 world wars, 20 million gas masks in one. They survived the loss of their rubber when Japan took the plantations, the biggest fire in the county's history, the oil shocks and recessions that closed factories all around them. And then, after 130 years on the banks of the River Avon, the works fell silent. How does a name that carried world champions and the most famous car in cinema simply disappear? What happened inside those gates? Chapter 1. The town, the wool trade, left behind. There is a particular kind of British town that exists because of one thing, that would not stand in the shape we recognise without it. Melksham, in Wiltshire, sitting on the River Avon between Bath and Chippenham and Trowbridge, is one of those towns, and the thing that built it, in the end, was not the wool that had given it its first life. It was rubber. In 1885, nobody in Melksham knew that yet. What they knew was that the wool was finished. For centuries this had been a weaving town, turning out white broadcloth, the looms clattering in mills strung along the water. By 1838, only 2 cloth mills were left working. The last of them, Matrover's mill, went under the auctioneer's hammer in 1888, and in one of those quiet ironies, the past hands out without comment that very mill would later be swallowed whole into the factory that saved the town. A wool mill sold off as a failure, becoming part of the largest employer Melksham would ever know. But the men who'd do the saving didn't start in Melksham at all. They started a few miles up the valley, in the village of Limpley Stoke, in a damp old cloth mill beside the river, called Avon Mill. The success of Stephen Moulton's rubber works at nearby Bradford-on-Avon, founded back in 1848, had shown the country gentry of the Avon Valley what could be done with this strange imported material. A local man, Giles Holbrow, and his son Willie had been watching. In 1875, they took their own old woolen cloth mill, Avon Mill, and turned it over to rubber. And in 1885, the Holbrows leased that small rubber business to 2 men who could not, on paper, have been less alike. Their names were E.G. Brown and J.C. Margetson. Brown was the money. He had come back from the colonies, as a certain class of Victorian gentleman did, with capital in his pocket and a hunger to put it to work. He was the investor, the man who could keep a young concern breathing while it found its feet. What he did not have, and knew he did not have, was the faintest practical understanding of how you actually turned raw rubber into something a customer would pay for. That was Margetson's part. James Margetson came from a Bedminster family over in Bristol, and he brought to the partnership what the records of the time call a practical knowledge of India rubber manufacture, combined with elementary chemistry. In plain terms, he knew the material. He knew how it behaved when you heated it, mixed it, pressed it, cured it. His own brother, A.G. Margetson, was tangled up in the Bristol wagon and carriage works, so the family had industry in the blood. This was a classic Victorian pairing, the kind that built half of industrial Britain. Returned colonial money married to a craftsman's hands. The gentleman and the maker. Neither could have managed it alone. The works they took on was modest, almost touchingly small. A single steam engine, 2 mixing machines, 4 presses, 2 calendar machines for rolling the rubber out into sheets. Willie Holbrow stayed on to manage the floor, and around 20 men did the work. The orders that kept the lights on came from the institutions of a confident empire: the War Office, the India Office, the railway companies, the wagon works, the collieries hungry for hose and belting and buffers. Unglamorous goods for an unglamorous trade. But it was a living, and it grew. It grew, in fact, faster than the little mill at Limpley Stoke could hold. Within 4 years they had simply run out of room. And here the story turns back to Melksham, and to those empty woolen mills standing idle where the wool trade had died. In 1890, the whole business packed up and moved downriver into them and incorporated itself with a name that would outlive everyone who chose it: the Avon India Rubber Company Limited. The India was not a place. It was the rubber itself. India rubber, the trade name for the natural latex tapped from trees half a world away. What they did to the river to make space for the works tells you everything about the ambition of the thing. The River Avon, the river the company was named for, the river the town was built along. They diverted it, moved part of it, filled in a stretch of it to win dry land for buildings that hadn't been imagined yet. A young company, barely solvent, reshaping the course of a river to make room for a future it could only guess at. And solvent it barely was. The early years were a near-run thing. In 1891, the firm worked so much overtime chasing orders that it tipped itself into a cash flow crisis. Too much work, not enough money coming in fast enough to pay for it. Then came the buffers. A consignment of railway buffers, shipped all the way to India, turned out to be poor quality, and the failure cost the company £550 in a single trading year. For a concern this size, in this decade, that was a wound that could have proved fatal. By 1894, the strain had outrun the original partner's resources, and Brown, the money, the colonial investor, resigned as managing director. The man who had bankrolled the gamble walked away before it paid off. The company he left behind survived him. It steadied itself, found firmer footing, and was taken in hand over the following decades by a name that gave it both capital and a kind of local respectability: the Fuller family. George Pargeter Fuller of the Fuller, Smith and Turner brewing dynasty, the family behind London Pride, became chairman at Melksham. He was a man of substance, a Liberal Member of Parliament through the late 1880s and into the 1890s, High Sheriff of Wiltshire, Master of Neston Park over at Corsham. His son Robert Fuller would be managing director by 1927. The Fullers were landed gentry lending their name and their money to a rubber works, and they gave Avon something a young firm badly needs: continuity and the quiet confidence of people who expect to be around for the long haul. So the company had survived its infancy. It had a home, a name, a river bent to its will, and backers who weren't going anywhere. What it didn't yet have was the product that would make it famous. That was about to change, and the change would come from a German engineer's invention and a road with almost nothing on it. Chapter 2. The Trilithon and the Motor Age. In 1885, the very year Brown and Margetson took on that little rubber mill at Limpley Stoke, a man named Gottlieb Daimler, working in Germany, fitted a small internal combustion engine to a frame and set the motor age in motion. The two events had nothing to do with each other. Not yet. But within a generation, the second would make the first one rich. For now, though, Avon made rubber goods. Carriage tyres, the solid rubber rims that softened the ride of horse-drawn vehicles. Cycle tyres, as the bicycle craze swept Britain. Hose, sheeting, belting, the endless plumbing of an industrial nation. By the turn of the century, the firm had taken on a second derelict cloth mill and the land around it, a site that would serve as the company's corporate headquarters for over 100 years. Avon was doing well by doing the ordinary things competently, but the directors had been watching the road. And in 1897, they sat down to discuss something that, looked at coldly, was close to madness. They discussed making pneumatic motor tyres, air-filled tyres for the motor car, at a moment when there were fewer than 50 British-made cars on the entire country's roads. Think about the nerve of that. A small Wiltshire rubber works, only recently clawed back from a cash crisis, deciding to invest in tooling and expertise for a product whose market did not yet exist. 50 cars, not 50,000. 50. You could have counted Avon's potential customers on the fingers of 10 hands. It was a bet not on the present, but on a future. The directors simply chose to believe in, that the motor car was coming, that it would come in numbers no one could yet imagine, and that every one of those cars would need something to put it in contact with the road. That same year, 1897, they made another decision that quietly transformed the works. They swapped steam for electricity. Out went the single-straining steam engine of the Limpley Stoke days. In came electric power, and with it a great leap in what the factory could produce. The works was modernising and gambling at the same time. The gamble took shape slowly, the way real industrial change usually does. Not in a flash, but stage by patient stage. In 1903, Avon ordered its first set of moulds for motor tyres. 29 beaded edge moulds, the technology of the day. The company now sorted its work into 3 streams: rubber for railways and electrical work, solid tyres, and pneumatic tyres for bicycles. In 1904, it joined the Motor Manufacturers' Society, and to this day the company dates its real tyre making from that year. By 1906, for the first time, Avon car tyres were being advertised to the public, and then came the order that proved the gamble had paid. A single contract from Rudge Whitworth, the great Coventry cycle and motor firm, called for 23,000 covers and 40,000 tubes, 23,000 tyres in one order. For a company that, a decade earlier, had nearly foundered over a £500 consignment of bad buffers, this was vindication on a scale that must have felt almost unreal. The bet on the empty road had come good. The cars were coming after all, and Avon was ready for them. The company gave itself a face to go with its new confidence. In 1908, it registered a trademark that would stay with Avon for the rest of its life: the Trilithon, the great standing stones of Stonehenge, that ancient Wiltshire monument just up the road. Beneath it ran a phrase chosen with real care: symbols of endurance. Stones that had stood on Salisbury Plain for 4,000 years, lending their permanence to a rubber tyre. It was a small Wiltshire firm reaching for something deep in the soil of its own county and claiming it as a promise. Endurance. The irony of that word, stamped on the side of every Avon tyre, is something we'll have to come back to. The years before the Great War were a time of restless experiment at Melksham. In 1910, the company began researching golf balls, a line it would later sell off to Dunlop, of all firms. A name that will loom very large over Avon's story before we're done. And in 1911, Avon made its first motorcycle tyre, an unremarkable event at the time that would, a century later, give the company a centenary worth marking and a claim to a kind of greatness no one in 1911 could have foreseen. By the eve of the war, then, Avon had transformed itself. The little rubber goods works that made buffers and belting had become a tyre manufacturer with national customers and a trademark borrowed from the Stone Age. And then, in August 1914, the world the company had grown up in came to an end, and Avon discovered what it was truly capable of. Chapter 3. The War, the Ball, and the Rolls-Royce. The war that broke out in the summer of 1914 found Avon, by happy accident, in the middle of proving exactly the thing the army most needed to know. In a test that read like an omen, 14 high-powered cars, all running on Avon pneumatic tyres, hauled a battery of heavy artillery guns at 21 miles an hour without a single mishap. Mechanized transport could move the weapons of war at speed, and it could do it on rubber made in Melksham. When the guns of August began to fire, Avon already knew its tyres could carry an army. For the next 4 years, the Melksham works went to war. From November 1914, its output was placed under the control of the Ministry of Munitions, as a nation that had expected a short conflict reorganized itself for a long one. And the breadth of what poured out of those gates is genuinely startling. Avon Tyres ran beneath naval and military bicycles, motorcycles, staff cars, lorries, ambulances, travelling workshops, and mobile field kitchens, and, remarkably, aeroplanes, the flimsy new flying machines that the war was turning from a curiosity into a weapon. The firm made trench-draining hoses to fight the mud that drowned men in the line, and protectors for the fuse caps of shells. The Admiralty became one of the company's great customers, taking some 40 tons of rubber sheeting and 20,000 feet of hose and tubing. But it was at sea that Avon made perhaps its strangest and most vital contribution. The company became the leading manufacturer of paravane diaphragms, the rubber components at the heart of the paravane, the towed underwater device that swept and cut the cables of the mines laid to sink British ships. Somewhere in the rubber-scented heat of a Wiltshire market town, men and women were making the parts that kept sailors alive in the North Sea. The war made Avon bigger too. In 1915, the company took over the bankrupt Sirdar Rubber Works at Greenland Mills, over in Bradford-on-Avon, the same town whose rubber industry had first inspired the Holbros decades before. The acquisition swelled the workforce by 300 at a stroke. A firm that had begun with 20 men was now absorbing whole factories. The gamble of 1897, the bet on the empty road, had grown into something that mattered to the war effort of a great power. When peace came in 1918, Avon faced the question every wartime manufacturer faced. What now? The guns had fallen silent, the enormous government orders had evaporated, and a works that had geared itself up for total war had to find something to do in a world at peace. The company's answer was to diversify with real flair. In 1921, it produced something that sounds almost frivolous beside paravanes and gun batteries, but which was a genuine feat of manufacturing: the first stitchless, mass-produced tennis ball, made right there at Melksham and sold to the public through the great cricketing house of Wisden. A rubber works that had armed minesweepers now turned its hand to the gentle thwack of the tennis court. It was the same skill, the deep understanding of how to mould and cure rubber to an exact and reliable standard, pointed at a happier target. Through the 1920s, the tyre business steadily professionalised. By 1927, the year Robert Fuller took over as managing director, carrying the family name into a second generation of leadership, Avon had built up 12 tyre distribution depots scattered across the country. The little firm with one mill now had a national footprint. And then came the moment that confirmed Avon's arrival in the front rank of British tyre makers. In 1933, the company became a public limited company, floated on the London Stock Exchange, a Wiltshire rubber works now answerable to shareholders, with capital to match its ambitions. In that same year, Avon Tyres were chosen, for the first time, as original equipment on Rolls-Royce motorcars. Consider what that meant. Rolls-Royce, the very byword for British engineering perfection, the maker of the finest motorcars in the world, looked at the field of tyre manufacturers and chose Avon to fit to its cars as they left the factory. The tyre Avon supplied was an air-cooled duo-tread design that very nearly doubled the mileage a set of tyres could be expected to give. A small company from a town the wool trade had abandoned was now good enough for the best cars on earth. That is the arc of Avon's first half-century. A returned colonial adventurer and a Bristol rubber chemist, working in a leased mill with 20 men. A river bent out of its course. A near-fatal cash crisis survived. A reckless, brilliant bet on a motor age that hadn't arrived. A war that proved what the works could do. And, by 1933, the maker of choice for Rolls-Royce, with a trademark borrowed from Stonehenge and a single word stamped beneath it. Endurance. The company had every reason to believe it had earned the word, and in a sense, it had. What was coming next? The racing tyres, the World Championships, the Aston Martin at Le Mans, the car that carried James Bond, would lift Avon to a height its founders could never have dreamed of. The golden age was beginning. Nobody at Melksham in 1933 had any reason to look at the word stamped on their tyres and wonder how long endurance lasts. Chapter 4. 20 million masks and a river of rubber. To understand the Avon works at the height of its powers, you have to start with the smell. Anyone who grew up in Melksham in the middle of the last century will tell you the same thing, unprompted, the moment the subject comes up. The whole town smelled of rubber. It hung over the streets, drifted across the river, settled into the fabric of people's clothes and the memory of their childhoods, that thick, warm, unmistakable scent of compounds curing under heat. You knew you were home when you could smell the Avon. But before the works became the heart of British racing, it went to war a second time. And the scale of what it did between 1939 and 1945 is almost impossible to picture standing in that quiet Wiltshire town today. 20 million gas masks. That is the number that came out of the Melksham factory during the Second World War. 20 million rubber faces, moulded and cured and assembled, sent out to a population that lived under the genuine fear of poison gas falling from the sky. The works ran around the clock, the presses never cooling, the floor never still. And when Japan overran the rubber plantations of Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, cutting off, at a stroke, the natural rubber that the entire industry depended on, Avon's chemists did what Margetson would have recognised from 60 years before. They went back to the material itself. They pioneered new techniques using the early synthetic rubbers, learning on the fly how to make the new compounds behave, because the alternative was making nothing at all. They even worked out how to bond solid rubber tyres directly to steel for the wheels of tanks. A works that had armed minesweepers in one war was shoeing tanks in the next. When the peace came and the factory could turn back to its real trade, it did so on a site that had grown into something formidable. By the post-war years, the Melksham works sprawled across 35 acres in the very centre of town, hard against the River Avon and a street called Scotland Road, with the Kennet and Avon Canal and the Great Western Railway running close by to carry the goods away. Woven into the heart of it all still stood the bones of the old Matravers woolen mill, the failed wool concern of the previous century, long since absorbed, still doing useful work. The site had grown so insatiably, so fast, that as early as 1901 the company had been forced to start building houses for its own workers, because the town simply could not accommodate the people the works needed. Terraced streets of Avon houses. The factory had begun, quite literally, to build the town around itself. Step inside the gates in, say, 1961, and you stepped into a controlled kind of chaos. The noise hit you first. The deep, constant baseline hum of a working factory, the heavy percussion of the curing presses closing, the hiss of steam, the rumble of trolleys, all of it underpinning the talk of men and women who had to raise their voices to be heard. The heat of the press shop was a physical thing, a wall you walked into, and everywhere that smell, the raw, earthy note of natural rubber, the sharper chemical edge of the synthetics, the dusty taste of the carbon black that got into everything and turned overalls grey and fingernails dark. The work moved through the building in stages, each one demanding its own particular skill. There were the mixers, where the raw rubber was blended with carbon black and chemicals into the compounds the recipes called for. There were the calendars and the extruders, where that compound was rolled and squeezed into the components of a tyre. There were the tyre builders themselves, and this was where the real craft lived, where men and women laid up the layers of the carcass by hand, building the unborn tyre piece by piece on a rotating drum with a precision that no amount of explaining can quite convey. The hand-building of a tyre is a genuine skill, learned over years, the kind of knowledge that lives in the fingers. And then the moulders, who took the raw, grey, unfinished tyre and committed it to the press, where heat and pressure and time cured it into the black, treaded, finished article. The moment a soft thing became a hard one. The moment a tyre was born. By 1961, the Melksham plant alone was turning out 1.5 million tyres a year. 1.5 million. From a works that had ordered its first 29 motor moulds barely 60 years earlier. The bet on the empty road had become a flood. Chapter 5. The Avon and the town that was made of it. A factory that size doesn't just employ a town, it becomes the town. It shapes the way people meet, marry, drink, play and bury one another. And at Melksham, the Avon did all of that, completely, for generations. The simplest way to understand it is through one family. Janet Rendell's family worked at the Avon across 3 generations, and her account of growing up in the town in the 1950s and 60s captures something no production figure ever could. Almost everyone she knew of her generation, she remembered, either had a family member at the Avon, as the whole town called it, the Avon, with the definite article, as though there could only be one, or knew someone who did. Her own father appears on the 1939 register with one of the most wonderfully specific job titles the British workplace has ever produced: giant tyre moulder, rubber factory, a man whose trade was moulding giant tyres. Both her father and her grandfather served in the Avon Fire Brigade, the work's own part-time fire crew, made up of the men who worked the floor, and the town built its leisure around the works as naturally as it built its working day. The local football side played as Melksham and Avon United through the 1920s. Melksham Rugby Club began life in 1978 as a works team for Avon Tyres. Melksham House became the Avon Sports and Social Club, the place where the social life of thousands of working families found its centre. The dances, the dinners, the clubs, the quiet pint after a shift. To work at the Avon was not just to have a job, it was to belong to a whole world, with its own institutions, its own loyalties, its own rhythm marked out by the shifts. What the wages bought was the ordinary, hard-won decency of a settled industrial life. A wage packet on a Friday that you could build a life on. A house, sometimes one the company itself had built. Stability passed down a family like an inheritance. Your grandfather's trade, your father's trade, and then yours. The works was the thing that made the future feel solid. And then, on one terrible day in 1966, a good part of it caught fire. The finished goods store went up, and it burned for hours. By the time it was out, it had destroyed a quarter of all the new stock and every piece of moulded rubber waiting to be sent away, at a cost of more than £1 million, and it earned, in the local memory, the grim title of the biggest fire in Wiltshire's history. The part-time Avon Fire Brigade, the brigade Janet Rendell's father and grandfather had served in, fought it, and after that day, the brigade was made full-time. The town never forgot it. Janet Rendell remembered that the very surface of Scotland Road had to be cleared afterwards of the solidified molten rubber that had flowed down the middle of the street while the store burned. Picture that. Picture. A river of melted rubber running down a Wiltshire high street, cooling and setting hard on the tarmac, so that the road itself had to be scraped clean. The town's lifeblood, quite literally, running in the gutter. But the works survived it, rebuilt and carried on. Through the 1950s, 60s and 70s, Avon Rubber was Melksham's dominant employer and one of the great names of the West Country economy. The Melksham site was the largest in the whole Avon group, and by the later 20th century, it employed close to 2,300 people, while across all its operations, the Avon Rubber Company, at its 1980s peak, employed something in the order of 6,000 across Britain. The exact figure for any given year is harder to pin down than you might think, lost in the gaps of an incompletely recorded history. But the shape of it is not in doubt. This was one of the largest employers for miles in any direction, the engine of an entire town's prosperity. The works had reached a stature that the wider establishment now formally recognised. In October 1973, the Minister for Industrial Development, Christopher Chataway, once an Olympic runner, one of the pacemakers for Roger Bannister's 4-minute mile, now a government minister, came to Melksham to open a new technical block and to commission a tyre incinerator and steam-raising unit that was, at that moment, the most modern of its kind anywhere in the world. A government minister travelling down to a Wiltshire town to cut a ribbon at a rubber works. That was the standing Avon had earned, the most modern facility of its type on earth, in Melksham. It was, by any measure, a good place to be. But none of it, not the 20 million masks, not the 1.5 million tyres a year, not the 3 generations of the Rendell family, not the minister with his ribbon. None of it is the reason the world has heard of Avon Tyres. The reason for that lies somewhere else entirely. It lies on the racetrack. Chapter 6. The Gold Standard. Here is the thing about Avon that the production figures will never tell you. For one extraordinary stretch of years, if you were the fastest motorcyclist on the planet, you almost certainly did it on rubber made in Melksham. The motorcycle story had begun quietly enough with that first motorcycle tyre back in 1911. After the Second World War, Avon set up a proper, scientific tyre testing regime at Melksham, and the timing was perfect. Norton, the great British racing marque, was losing races on poor tyres, and in 1952 it turned to Avon for help. From that partnership, something remarkable grew. The relationship took off, the testing paid off, and the results began to arrive in a torrent that is genuinely hard to credit. Between 1958 and 1963, 6 seasons, every single solo motorcycle world champion rode to his title on Avon Tyres. Everyone, not most, all of them. In that golden run, the company claimed 31 championships and 77 records. Avon Rubber carried the first ever 100-mile-an-hour lap of the Isle of Man TT, the most fearsome and revered road race in the world, and the roll call of riders who trusted their lives to those tyres at 100-odd miles an hour reads like the entire pantheon of the sport. Jeff Duke, who took Avon's first world title back in 1951, John Surtees, who would later become the only man ever to win world championships on both 2 wheels and 4, Mike Halewood, perhaps the greatest of them all, Derek Minter, Phil Redd, John Hartler, and later the irrepressible Barry Sheene. The men behind the scenes were characters in their own right. Avon's competition manager, Bob Walsham, was famous enough in the paddock that on one occasion, when the sidecar world champion Eric Oliver found himself without a passenger, Walsham simply pulled on a set of leathers and climbed into the sidecar chair himself. The ballast and the bravery, in a racing sidecar, being every bit as vital as the man steering. That was the kind of firm Avon was. The competition manager would get in and ride, and the names didn't stay locked in the past. The Avon Speedmaster, the Roadrunner, the V-rated Venom, the Road Rider that became one of Britain's best-selling tyres for everyday motorcyclists, the Cobra Cruiser range. These were tyres that ordinary riders fitted to ordinary bikes, carrying a little of that championship pedigree onto every B-road in the country. The dominance never really faded in the world of classic racing either. At the Goodwood Revival in 2009, every single one of the top 10 finishers in a historic motorcycle race was riding on Avon. the winner being Wayne Gardner, himself a former 500cc Grand Prix world champion. That same year, the sidecar legend Dave Molyneux took his 14th Isle of Man TT victory on Avon rubber. But the most famous Avon connection of all isn't a motorcycle at all. It's a car, and not just any car. From 1953, Avon shod the works Aston Martin sports racing team, and the list of drivers who pulled on their helmets and trusted those tyres is a who's who of British motor racing. Stirling Moss, Roy Salvadori, Tony Brooks, Peter Collins, Reg Parnell. The crowning moment came on the 9th of June afternoon in 1959 at the greatest endurance race in the world. Roy Salvadori and the American Carroll Shelby drove an Aston Martin DBR1 running on Avon Tyres to victory in the 24 Hours of Le Mans on the way to securing the World Sports Car Championship for Aston Martin. A tyre made in Melksham had won Le Mans. And then there is the one image that needs no explanation at all. In 1964, in the film Goldfinger, James Bond's silver Aston Martin DB5 rolled onto cinema screens and into the imagination of the entire world, and it rolled on Avon Tyres. The single most famous car in the history of cinema, the gadget-laden Aston that every child of the 60s wanted, ran on rubber from a Wiltshire market town. Nearly 50 years later, when the same DB5 was brought back for the 2012 film Skyfall, it was Avon Tyres that were fitted to it once again. From the empty roads of 1897 to the most iconic car ever filmed. That is how far the bet on the motor age had carried the little works on the Avon. Chapter 7. The Summit and the Shadow. By the start of the 1980s, Avon stood at a height its founders could not have imagined. 1.5 million tyres a year at its peak. The gold standard of world motorcycle racing, a Le Mans winner, original equipment on Rolls-Royce, on Bentley, on Aston Martin, on Land Rover, the car that carried Bond, and then, at what looks now like the very summit, the company did something that felt like a triumphant return to the absolute pinnacle of the sport. It went back into Formula One. The opening came suddenly. When the American giant Goodyear pulled out of Formula One at the end of 1980, and the French firm Michelin would only guarantee supply for part of the coming season, a gap opened at the very top of motorsport, and an all-British outfit called International Race Tyre Service, staffed by experienced engineers who had cut their teeth at Firestone and Goodyear, struck a deal with Avon to set up a racing tyre division inside the Melksham factory. The pace was breathtaking. Within 100 days, they had produced their first Formula One tyres, supplying the Fittipaldi team at the San Marino Grand Prix in May 1981. The venture was driven forward by A.K. Mitchard, the chairman of Avon Tyre, working with Monsieur Jean Monnier of IRTS. There was even a touch of pure show business about it. Avon's first championship point in this new Formula One adventure was scored by a Swedish driver named Tommy Slim Borgard, who finished 6th at the 1981 British Grand Prix at Silverstone in a car carrying ABBA sponsorship, for Borgard had been a session drummer for the band, a Wiltshire Tyre, an ABBA drummer, a point at the British Grand Prix. Eddie Cheever, on Avon Tyres in a Tyrrell, came home 5th at the German Grand Prix that same year, and there was a deeper crown still, one that would outlast the brief Formula One return. From 1982, Avon became the sole controlled tyre supplier to the British Formula 3 Championship, the proving ground where the stars of tomorrow learned their trade. In 1983, a young Brazilian named Ayrton Senna won the British Formula 3 title on Avon Tyres, winning the first 9 races of the season in a row. The list of British Formula 3 champions who came up on Avon rubber reads, as one of the company's own motorsport men later put it, like a who's who of racing: Senna, Damon Hill, Mika Häkkinen, Johnny Herbert, Jenson Button, David Coulthard, Rubens Barrichello, the tyre that taught the future of Formula One how to win. This was the peak, and the cruel thing about a peak is that you can only ever recognise it from the far side, because buried in Avon's very success was the seed of everything that came after, and it had been visible, if anyone had cared to read it that way, for decades. Back in 1955, a report from the Monopolies and Restrictive Practices Commission had named Avon as one of the 5 main sellers in the entire British tyre market, listed alongside Dunlop, Goodyear, Firestone and Michelin. For one brief official moment, Avon stood in the same league as the global giants. But of those 5 names, 4 were among the largest tyre corporations on earth. And one was a 35-acre works in a Wiltshire market town. What kept Avon in that company was the very thing that would, in the end, doom it. Avon's genius was for the niche, for the specialist tyre, the odd size, the small batch racing and classic and motorcycle rubber that no giant could be bothered to make. As the company's biggest motorsport distributor, Paul Nichols of BMTR, would put it years later, with the plain honesty of a man who loved the place. That was what Avon was always very good at, making niche products that no one else could do. And then he added the line that contains the whole tragedy in a single breath, which is also, of course, part of its downfall. Stand at the summit in 1983. The Le Mans win behind them. Senna winning on their tyres. The Bond car on their rubber. A return to the Formula One grid. From up there, who could possibly have seen the cliff? Nobody inside those walls did. The shadow was already lengthening across the floor, and not one of the men building tyres in Melksham that year could feel the cold of it. The work that made them irreplaceable to the enthusiast was the very work that would, in time, make them worthless to the giant about to come and buy them. Chapter 8. The Clouds Gather. The trouble didn't announce itself. It rarely does. It arrived the way bad weather arrives over the West Country. A change in the light, a drop in the temperature, a sense that something is coming long before the first rain falls. The first of it came from outside, and from forces no Wiltshire boardroom could control. In 1973, the oil shock sent the price of energy, and of the petrochemicals that go into a modern tyre soaring almost overnight. A tyre is, in a real sense, a product of oil, the synthetic rubber, the chemicals, the energy to cure it. And when oil quadrupled in price, the economics of every tyre maker on earth turned hostile at once. Then came a subtler poison. The radial tyre, the new standard, simply lasted far longer than the tyres it replaced. A motorist who once bought a new set every couple of years now kept them for many more. Better tyres meant fewer tyres sold, and an industry that had built itself for one level of demand found itself with far too much capacity for the demand that remained. Chronic oversupply settled over the whole world tyre trade like a fog that would never quite lift. Avon felt it quickly. The 1975 accounts showed a loss of more than £500,000, the first real blood in the water. And when the deep recession of the early 1980s arrived, the cuts came in earnest. The Bridgen factory was closed, with 260 jobs gone. The plants at Moseley and Cape Heaton were shut. Whole divisions were sold off. Avon Rubber survived the 80s only by retreating, by pulling back to the specialisms and the racing tyres, the high-value niches where it could still compete, and abandoning the broad mass-market ground it could no longer hold. And here is the quiet cruelty of it. That retreat into the niche was the right decision. It was, very probably, the only decision. It kept the company alive when bigger names were drowning. But it also completed the transformation that the 1955 Monopolies Report had hinted at decades before. Avon was no longer one of 5 great sellers in the British market. It was now, increasingly, a specialist. Brilliant, beloved, world-famous among racers and motorcyclists, and commercially marginal to the global giants who measured their output, not in the thousands, but in the tens of millions. To see where this led, you only have to look at what was happening to the rest of British tyre-making, and to one name above all, Dunlop. Once the 8th largest public company in all of Britain, with 102,000 employees in 1970, the very name Avon had once been listed beside as an equal. Dunlop made a series of poor decisions on radial technology, entered a disastrous joint venture with the Italian firm Pirelli, and was swallowed by the conglomerate BTR in 1985, its tyre rights eventually passing to Japan's Sumitomo. The mighty Fort Dunlop in Birmingham, that vast self-contained industrial city, would cease mainstream tyre production. Dunlop's iconic Birmingham motorsport tyre operation finally closed in 2014. The pattern was being written in letters too large to ignore. British tyre-making was dying, name by name. And the deaths followed a script, a proud independent firm, a takeover by something larger and more distant, a slow consolidation into somewhere cheaper, and then the gates closing on a workforce that had done nothing wrong except work in the wrong place at the wrong moment in history. Inside the Melksham works, the vulnerabilities were physical and undeniable to anyone who walked the site. It was old. It was small. It was hemmed into the centre of a market town with the river on one side and houses on the others, with no room to grow. You could not bolt a modern, high-volume production line onto a 35-acre site wrapped around the bones of a Victorian woolen mill. The place that had once been an advantage, woven into the heart of its town, was now a cage, and the numbers tell the slow strangulation with a clarity that needs no commentary. In 1993, the Melksham operation made a profit of £4.3 million. By 2020, that profit had fallen to £6,873, not £6 million, not 600,000, £6,873. A works that had won Le Mans, reduced over a quarter of a century to a profit you could fit in a family car. That was the ground on which the fatal decisions would be made. Not a healthy company destroyed by a single act of malice, a fragile, brilliant, cornered company, making reasonable choices, each of which moved the work a little further from the hands that knew how to do it. Chapter 9. The Promise in Ohio. By the mid-1990s, the board of Avon Rubber plc, the parent company, the diversified group that the old India Rubber Company had become, sat looking at a problem with no comfortable answer. The group had spread into many things over the decades. Tyres, yes, but also inflatable boats, gas masks, medical products, milking equipment for the dairy trade, automotive components. And the tyre business, for all its glamour and heritage, was the hungriest mouth of all. Tyres ate capital. The global market was drowning in overcapacity. The margins were thin and getting thinner. Meanwhile, the group's protective equipment arm, the descendant of those 20 million wartime gas masks, was higher margin and full of promise. So the board made a decision. They would sell the tyres. You can follow the logic, and it is important to follow it fairly, because nothing about it was wicked. A board has a duty to the whole enterprise, not to one part of it. The tyre business was capital-hungry and globally exposed. The protective business was the future. Selling tyres would free up money and management attention to chase the higher margin work. On a spreadsheet, in a boardroom, in 1996, it was simply the right answer. The buyer was the Cooper Tyre and Rubber Company of Findlay, Ohio. The negotiations ran for some 18 months. This was no impulse purchase, and on the 18th of February, 1997, Cooper announced that it would buy Avon's tyre operations for $110.4 million. In the British press, the figure was reported as around £60 million. The deal closed the following month. Cooper took everything, all the shares of Avon Tyres and Avon Technical Services, the Melksham factory itself, 3 distribution companies across France, Germany and Switzerland, and, this is the part that would matter most in the end, the worldwide right to use the Avon name on tyres. The name itself, the trilithon, the symbols of endurance, now belonged to a company in Ohio. The new entity was called Cooper Avon Tyres Limited, and here is where we must listen very carefully to what was said, because the words spoken in 1997 would hang over everything that followed. Cooper's chairman, Patrick Rooney, called the purchase an exciting and logical global extension of Cooper's presence, the company's first step toward expanding its tyre manufacturing outside the United States. The tone was expansive, optimistic, the language of a company planting a flag, not closing a chapter, and then came the sentence that the people of Melksham would have every reason to remember. Cooper stated plainly that it had no reorganization or restructuring plans that would affect general operations or overall employment at Avon Tyres. No plans that would affect employment. The Avon operation would report to Cooper's Vice President of Operations, Bill Klein, working alongside Avon's own Managing Director, Rod Pottow. Continuity, reassurance, a bigger, richer parent who promised to leave the family alone. It is worth being clear about something. There is no evidence that Patrick Rooney was lying in 1997. By every indication, he meant it. Cooper did invest in the Avon motorsport brand. It made Melksham its European headquarters and technical centre. For a time, the new arrangement looked exactly like the bright global future the press release had promised. The tragedy of Avon is not a tragedy of broken promises made in bad faith. It is the tragedy of promises made in good faith by men who would not be the ones, years later, sitting in the chairs where the next decisions got made. A promise is only as durable as the person who made it, and corporate ownership has a way of outliving the people and the intentions that began it. Meanwhile, the parent company that had sold the tyres prospered exactly as its board had hoped. Avon Rubber plc poured itself into protective equipment and dairy and automotive components and grew into a successful FTSE 250 defence business. In 2021, it renamed itself Avon Protection. The company that had begun by bending a river to make tyres had, in the end, thrived precisely by walking away from the thing the town of Melksham was built on. The name lived on in the City of London, attached to gas masks and body armour. The works lived on in Wiltshire, attached now to owners 3,000 miles away. The two had been cut apart, and only one of them was safe. Chapter 10. The Notice on the Gate. For a while, a good while, the Cooper years felt like stability, but the distance between Melksham and the people who decided its fate kept quietly growing. The first sign was a small one, easy to miss, the kind of thing that only looks like a warning in hindsight. In January 2006, the subsidiary dropped the word Avon from its corporate name and became simply Cooper Tyre and Rubber Company Europe Limited. The vice president for European operations, Ron Shield, explained it as part of a global rebrand. The Avon product still carried its name. The tyres still said Avon on the side. But the company, the legal and corporate self of the thing, had quietly stopped being Avon at all. A name that had stood since 1890 slipped off the door, and almost no one outside the trade noticed. Then, in October 2018, came the decision that the people of Melksham would never forgive and never forget. Cooper announced that it would end the production of light vehicle tyres, the ordinary car and SUV tyres that made up the bulk of Melksham's volume, and move that work to its plant in Kruševac, in Serbia. Cooper had bought the Kruševac operation back in 2012 for around €13 million, with plans to invest as much as 50 million more. It was newer, it was larger, it was, above all, cheaper. And the cold arithmetic was laid out without flinching by the general manager, Jaap van Wessem, in words that were accurate, defensible, and devastating all at once. Melksham, he said, was an older, smaller facility that did not offer economies of scale, and it was the highest cost facility in the entire global Cooper network. Every word of that was true. That is what made it unanswerable. The site that had been an advantage in 1890, small, central, woven into its town, was now, by the brutal logic of global tyre manufacturing, a liability. Up to 300 of the 732 European jobs were now at risk, but it was not the decision itself that left the deepest wound. It was the manner of it. The story passed into local memory and has the awful specificity of truth. Workers arrived for their shift to find a notice on the gate, calling all staff to a meeting in the car park. They gathered there, in the open, on the tarmac of the works their fathers and grandfathers had built their lives around, and there the redundancies were announced. The meeting, by the accounts that survive, was over within minutes of beginning. The staff filed out as they had filed in, except that now each of them carried a letter in the hand, in a car park. That was how generations of Avon men learned that their work was going to Serbia, and there was a detail crueler still. Some of the Melksham workers had already been sent out to Serbia, to Kruševac, to help train the very people who would replace them. They had taught their own successors. They had handed over the knowledge in their hands to the workers in the cheaper plant, and then come home, and then stood in a car park to be told that the knowledge had been received and that they were no longer needed. One worker spoke of his father, Tom Wilkins, and what the older man had said about the mood in that meeting, that the worst part was the uncertainty, not knowing who would go, that everyone was so nervous. That is the human texture the spreadsheet never records. Not a number, a room full of frightened men in a car park, and a father trying to put words to it for his son. And running underneath it all was a reassurance, delivered alongside the bad news, that sounded at the time like a lifeline. Cooper said it planned to keep the production of Avon motorcycle tyres in Melksham, and that it might even have the opportunity to grow that business. Motorcycle tyres would stay. The specialist work, the racing rubber, the famous stuff, that would remain in Wiltshire. The thing Avon had always been best at would be the thing that kept the gates open. Hold on to that promise, because in just a few years it too would be quietly set aside, not by Cooper, but by the company that was about to buy Cooper whole. Chapter 11. Swallowed. On the 22nd of February, 2021, the Goodyear Tyre and Rubber Company of Akron, Ohio, announced that it would acquire Cooper Tyre in a transaction with a total enterprise value of approximately $2.5 billion. And with that, in a deal negotiated in American boardrooms about American and Chinese strategic priorities, the Melksham works changed hands for the second time in a generation, passing to owners more distant and more indifferent to a Wiltshire town than any before them. The language around the deal told you everything about where Melksham stood in the thinking. Goodyear's chairman and chief executive, Richard Kramer, called the acquisition transformational, praising Cooper's complementary product range and its capable manufacturing assets and the opportunities for improved cost efficiency. Cooper's own chief executive, Brad Hughes, said he was extremely proud of Cooper's 107-year history and that the deal marked the start of a new chapter. The deal closed on the 7th of June, 2021, but read past the warm words to what the strategy actually was, and Melksham simply isn't in it. The logic Goodyear set out for its shareholders was about expanding leadership in the United States and doubling its presence in China. Europe barely featured. In the framing of the people who now owned it, the Cooper and Avon business in Europe was, in Goodyear's own terms, relatively insignificant. The whole of Melksham generated £141 million, just 7.5% of Cooper's group sales. A rounding error in a multi-billion-dollar transaction. The works that had won Le Mans and shod the Bond car was now a small, high-cost, faraway plant in a portfolio so large that the people running it could be forgiven for forgetting it was there at all. For a company under pressure, a plant like that does not survive long. And Goodyear was under pressure. It was hemorrhaging money in Europe, reporting for the fourth quarter of 2022 a net loss of $104 million, the bulk of it from heavy losses in the Europe, Middle East, and Africa region. In January 2023, it announced a plan to cut around 500 jobs worldwide, roughly 200 of them in Europe, as part of a broad drive to streamline its costs. Set against all that, Melksham was exactly the kind of thing a company in that position closes. Old, small, expensive, redundant within a network that now also owned the Dunlop name and a modern cheap Serbian factory built precisely to absorb its work. The decision, when it came, was not a thunderclap. It was the last, quiet turn of a screw that had been tightening for 26 years. In October 2022, Cooper Tyre and Rubber Company Europe, by now wholly Goodyear's, announced its intention to begin consultation on the proposed closure of the entire Melksham tyre production facility. Not the car tyres this time, not part of it, all of it, including the motorcycle and racing tyres that, 4 years earlier, the workers had been promised would stay. 350 people were put on notice of redundancy. The words chosen to deliver the news were careful and, in their way, sincere. The Human Resources Director, Gavin Champion, said it was with deep sadness that the company had announced its intention to begin consultation on the proposed closure of the Melksham facility, that the site had struggled to be competitive for some considerable time, that everyone involved had worked extremely hard to keep operations going for as long as possible, and that this had become increasingly challenging in the current business environment. Deep sadness. Struggled to be competitive. The current business environment. There is no villainy in those words. There is no rage in them. No greed you can point to, no cartoon executive twirling a moustache in Ohio. There is only the language of arithmetic, the calm, regretful vocabulary of a decision that everyone involved would describe as reasonable. And that, in the end, is the most haunting thing about how Avon died. Nobody set out to kill it. It was simply, after 130 years, no longer the right answer to a question being asked very far away. Chapter 12. The Last Tyre. Production carried on through most of 2023. The works kept running near full capacity until around September, and then it began, slowly, to wind down. The orders tailed off. The presses, which had run around the clock through 2 world wars, started to fall quiet one by one. Men and women who had given their working lives to the place began, in ones and twos, to leave. The community did not go quietly. Unite the Union, representing the 350, fought the timing and the decision. The union's Tony Hulbert pointed out the human cruelty of the calendar, that the timing was poor, with mortgage rates rising, and that the company could at least have waited until the new year so people could see how things were looking before losing their jobs. The local Member of Parliament at the time, Michelle Donnellan, offered support and pledged to stay in close contact with the company through the consultation. The town's councillors spoke for a place in mourning. Councillor John Hubbard said what everyone in Melksham already knew in their bones, that the plant had been part of the DNA of the town for over a century. But there was a deeper alarm spreading, far beyond Melksham, through the whole world of historic motorsport. Because Melksham was not just a tyre factory, by 2023 it was the last motorcycle tyre production facility in the entire United Kingdom, and, crucially, the maker of the specialist classic racing tyres that an entire community of vintage motorcyclists depended on to keep their machines on the track. The plan, as it became understood, was that Goodyear would simply stop making classic motorcycle racing tyres altogether when Melksham closed. The machinery would be mothballed, not moved, and so distributors scrambled. One, TGA Racing, stockpiled more than £250,000 worth of tyres, buying up everything it could before the gates shut, because once they shut, there might be nothing more, ever again. Paul Nicholls, the same man who had named Avon's genius and its doom in the same breath, put it bluntly, the closure would basically kill off the Avon motorsport brand. And then it came down to a single day, and a handful of people, and the very last tyres. The man at the centre of it was Alan Yates, a mould changer with nearly 19 years at the works. As his colleagues left the floor to go and sign their final redundancy contracts, Alan kept the presses running. He decided he might as well keep the last few tyres going through, and as it happened, one of the very last was for a 1950s vintage motorbike, exactly the kind of small, specialist, irreplaceable job that Avon had spent a century making better than anyone on earth. His colleagues didn't get back from signing their papers until he was putting that last tyre in. His own words, spoken at the time, are the truest eulogy this story has, and they belong to him, not to any narrator. He called it a strange historical moment. He said it felt quite sad to be winding down, that some of the lads had been there nearly 40 years. He had been there for the 100-year centenary. He had grown up in Melksham as a boy and could remember the big fire. He had relations who'd worked there. His brother had worked there in the 70s and his uncles and aunts. It had been, he said simply, a big employer. A man who remembered the centenary, who remembered the fire of 1966, whose brother and uncles and aunts had all passed through those gates, curing the final tyres with his own hands, alone on the floor, while everyone else queued up to end their employment. There is the whole 130 years, standing at a single press. In the racing department, a man named Jordan Smith cured the last racing tyre. The team gathered round for it, the small knot of people who remained, standing together for the moment the last tyres came off the line. Nobody made a speech. There was nobody left to make one to. And then, on Wednesday, the 20th of December, 2023, the factory closed for good. The sources cannot even agree on how many years ended that day. Some said 112, dating it from the first motorcycle tyre. Some said 118. One said 132 years of production. The firm itself dated its tyre making from 1904 and its rubber heritage from 1885. The arithmetic of the ending was as contested as the arithmetic that had caused it. But the number didn't matter. What mattered was that it was over. A works that began with 20 men in a leased mill, that bent a river, that armed 2 world wars, that carried every motorcycle world champion of an era and won Le Mans and shod the most famous car in cinema, switched off 3 days before Christmas by men who had never smelled the rubber on Scotland Road. Into the summer of 2024, a skeleton crew stayed on to decommission the site, to take apart, carefully and methodically, the thing that could never now be put back together. Chapter 13. The Silence on Scotland Road. A factory that has run for over a century has a sound, even when you stop noticing it. The hum of it, the movement of people, the breath of the ventilation, the low, constant pulse of a place that never fully stops. The men and women of Melksham had lived their whole lives inside that sound. And when it stopped, what was left on Scotland Road was a silence in the wrong shape. A quiet where there should have been the rhythm of the presses, settling over a 35-acre site in the middle of a town that no longer quite knew what it was for. For the workers, the company did what companies now do. It engaged a consultancy, LHH Penner, to provide what is called career transition support, and worked with the town council, the county council, the Department for Work and Pensions, and the local college. The machinery of help was wheeled into place, but what could not be transitioned, what no program could find a new home for, was the thing itself, the skill, the hand-building of a racing tyre, the laying up of the carcass, the deep knowledge of how rubber behaves that James Margetson had carried into that mill in 1885, and that had been passed down, hand to hand, floor to floor, for 130 years. That craft did not retrain. It simply left Britain, and it has not come back. The brand, though, survived, without the town. In the middle of 2025, Avon-branded motorcycle tyres were relaunched, now made in the European Union, positioned just below Goodyear's premium Dunlop range, with models bearing the old familiar names, the Cobra Chrome, the Spirit, the Road Rider. The motorsport assets and the intellectual property were acquired by a firm called Nova Motorsport, which bought a tyre factory at Camac in Portugal and produced its first Nova-branded rallycross tyre there in the summer of 2024. Avon car and motorcycle tyres are made now in Kruševac, in Serbia, and Montluçon, in France. The name endures, on the side of tyres built in places the founders never heard of, by hands that never knew Melksham. The trilithon still stands. The stones of Stonehenge still promise endurance. Only the works they were stamped to has gone. And the site? By the middle of 2025, Goodyear had completed the sale of the 35-acre site to a firm called Melksham Development Company Limited. Its director, Michael Hurst, confirmed surveys for asbestos and for bats ahead of demolition. Bats, having moved into the empty buildings, now legally entitled to a consideration the workers never received. The plans are for a mixed-use scheme: housing, employment space, leisure. The site is named as a key regeneration site in the town's own neighbourhood plan. By 2025, some of the buildings along the main road had already begun to come down. A community group fought on to save 40 acres of riverside green space from development, and Councillor Jenny Westbrook spoke for many when she said that no one denied the factory itself was a brownfield site, that it should be redeveloped and turned into something for the community. She is right, of course. Something should fill that space. A town cannot live forever in mourning for a factory. And yet, as of 2025, the striking old Avon building still stood, and so did the wrought iron archway, the arch that generations of Melksham men and women had walked beneath on their way to a morning shift, on their way to build the tyres that carried champions. It stood over nothing now, an arch into an empty yard. Chapter 14. Symbols of Endurance. There is a word stamped on every Avon tyre ever made. It was chosen in 1908, set beneath the standing stones of Stonehenge, and it was meant as a boast and a promise, both. Endurance. Think of everything that word was asked to carry. It carried 20,000 feet of Admiralty hose and the diaphragms that swept the mines. It carried 20 million gas masks. It carried Jeff Duke and John Surtees and Mike Halewood, every solo world champion for 6 straight years. It carried Salvadori and Shelby across the line at Le Mans, and it carried James Bond's Aston Martin onto cinema screens across the world. It carried Ayrton Senna to the first of all his titles. For 130 years, the works on the river endured everything that came for it. 2 world wars, the loss of its rubber, the biggest fire in the county's history, oil shocks, recessions, the slow death of British heavy industry on every side of it. What it could not endure, in the end, was being owned by people for whom it was simply too small to matter. That is the truth this story leaves us with, and it is a strange and uncomfortable one. Avon was not destroyed by failure. It was destroyed by being magnificent at the wrong thing, by a mastery of the small, the specialist, the handmade and the irreplaceable that made it priceless to the enthusiast and worthless to the volume maker. Its genius and its doom were the same thing. The very skill that made it loved made it unprofitable at the only scale its final owners cared about. Walk down Scotland Road now, and the smell is gone. That thick, warm rubber scent that told a Melksham child they were home. Gone, and it will not come back. The presses are silent. The arch stands over an empty yard, waiting for the demolition crews and the housing and the leisure facilities that will, in time, make the ground useful again. Somewhere a 1950s motorbike is still running on the last tyre Alan Yates ever cured. And somewhere in a paddock at a historic race meeting, a man is checking the last of his stockpiled Avon racing tyres and wondering what he'll do when they're finally gone. 130 years, 20 men and a leased mill, and a river bent to make room for a future. The gold standard of a sport, the name on the most famous car in the world, and then a notice on a gate, a meeting in a car park, a letter in the hand, and the gates closing 3 days before Christmas. Switched off, one reasonable decision at a time, until the silence settled on Scotland Road and nobody came in on Monday.